Alright, let's start with a simple plane. Go to Geometry Node Editor, click on New, give it a name Path. Now let's add a Bezier curve. Let's call it Path as well. Now in the Geometry Node Editor, drag the path curve. Now if I edit the curve, let's go to Edit and delete the existing vertices. And let's try to draw this. You can see it is not sitting on the ground. So let's do that first. So in the Geometry Node Editor, let's add a Set Position node and a Position node. Now let's add a Vector Math and a Combine XYZ node. Now, first of all, I want to just resample this curve. So resample it with a length. Now I want to set this position with the position combined with this node, and I want x to be 1, y to be 1, but z to be 0. And let's multiply these together and put it in the position node. Now if I see the output of this, you can see the z value of these points is zeroed out and the curve is always sitting on the ground. So if I again edit it, you can see it is always on the ground. Okay, so now let's make a geometry out of this curve. So let's add a curve to mesh node and I'm gonna use a curved line. Let's give it a x value of 1 and at the end -1. Let's make z 0 and I want to control this in the modifier stack here. So let's add a Combine XYZ node and let's plug one input from this to x value, and this in the tool setting here we can call it width. So this value is exposed here now. Now I want this negative value as well. So let's add a math node and multiply this value with -1. And again another Combine XYZ node, plug it to x. So now plug this to start and the -1 to end. To visualize this, let's add a Join Geometry node and join this curve line here. So now if I give the value of width, let's say about 1.5, so here is our line. Now let's create the actual mesh. So from this resample curve, plug this curve to curve and this curve line to profile curve, and now this output mesh to join geometry. So here is our geometry. Alright, so now I want to extrude this center down a bit to create a river type of shape. So let's do that. For that we'll use a proximity node. So geometry proximity, and we'll use the proximity of this curve itself to bend this face from the center. So geometry proximity require a mesh. So let's add a curve to mesh node And let's use our existing curve. So this, plug it to curve, and now plug the mesh to target. Select edges because we don't have faces for this curve. Now let's add another set position node and a position node. And again, I want to modify the z values of this face. So let's add a vector math and set it to subtract. Now I want to subtract the position of the faces in the z direction from this proximity. So let's add a combine xyz node, and just to enhance the value of this distance, I'm gonna use another math node. Let's make a little room here. So plug the distance to value and just multiply it with a certain value. Now plug this multiplied value to z because we want the faces to be affected in z, and subtract it from the position. Now plug this vector to the position. So now we need the geometry. So the geometry was our curve to mesh. So control right click and drag to cut this and plug this mesh to geometry. And now finally this geometry to our output. Alright, so now you can see this is moving, but because this doesn't have sufficient faces, so we need to add a little bit of subdivisions to it. So for that, add a subdivide node. So now you can see the effect, and this value strengthens the effect. Okay, now let's control this effect. So let's add a color ramp. Let me add some room here. So I'll use this color ramp after this multiply node. So plug it here and just modify this value. So now you can see the effect, and it is going the opposite direction. So let's flip this color ramp, and now it is good. So now this value will apply to the position of proximity of the curve, and to control the depth of this effect, just add another multiply node. So duplicate it and add after this color ramp. So now this value will control how deep it is. Let's add some more subdivision. And with the color ramp, you can just check the curvature of this like this. Okay, now let's add another water plane over to this. So again, duplicate this curve to mesh node and another curve line. And this time I am just going to use a fixed value for this. So add this curve to profile curve and our resample curve to main curve. And let's plug it to our join geometry. So you can see another plane here. And just move this water plane a little bit down so it is merged with this. So to move it, let's use a transform node and just transform it in the z direction. So give it a value of -0.1 like this. Okay, now let's create a quick material for this ground and water. So click new in the shader graph. Let's call it ground, and I'm just gonna simply use a noise texture with a color ramp. Plug it to base color, and to see the effect of this we need to go back to the geometry node editor, and the set position which is creating this ground, just add a set material node, and in here plug your ground material. Now let's go back to shading and select this shaded material view. Now you can see the effect of this. So let's make this green, this one a lighter yellow, add another color, something like this. Decrease the specular, increase the roughness. If you have Node Wrangler add-on enabled, just select the noise texture and press Ctrl T to add mapping and texture coordinate. To add a little bit of detail, let's add a Voronoi texture, and again add a mapping node, keep it to object. Again I'll add a color ramp, and Ctrl Shift right click drag to add a mix node. Keep it at darken. And change this color ramp to be the factor. I want the second color to be dark green. Now let's change this color ramp. To invert the effect, flip the color ramp. Okay, here I have created a water material simply by adding a emission and transparent BSDF together with a noise texture, and I have also added another noise to create a little bit of bump, and then finally add another mix shader to get the output. Now let's add this water material to our water plane. So again, go to your geometry node editor, set material, and select water. Alright, now I want to change this ground color underwater. So at this area, I want this color to be gray, not green. So we can influence this texture or this material from the geometry node editor itself with the proximity of the curve. So let's see how we can do this. So in the geometry node editor, where we use the geometry proximity of the curve, after the color ramp we use this multiply node. So let's duplicate this multiply again so that we can modify this to change the texture value here. Let's plug the color again to it, and the output of this value, let's plug it to geometry output node. So it creates a value in the output. You can see it here in the tool. Click on this value and make this type to be color. Let's give it a name like underwater, and copy this and plug the same name here, underwater. Now we'll use this attribute in the shader editor. So let's go to shading, So this is our ground material. In here, let's add another principled BSDF. Let's make it a gray color, something like this. Now I'm going to use a attribute node, and in attribute, let's again paste our attribute underwater and Control Shift drag to mix these two, and the factor to mix these is going to be our attribute color. So now you can see the effect. Again, to invert this effect, let's add a color ramp. And flip the color ramp. Now you can see here the effect of the secondary color. Now we have two values to control this color. We can use the color ramp from here, and we can also control this from here. Now our ground is looking very flat, so let's add a little bit of noise to our ground. So in the geometry node editor, again add a noise texture and another set position node and a position node. Add a vector math and a combine XYZ. So again, the factor will go to Z, and just add the position of these two. Now this set position node will come after all this, so I'll just add the set position, previous set position to this one, and this set position to the final set material. Now let's plug the position node from here. So you can see the noise. Now let's control this effect. So let's add a math node. And I'm going to multiply it with a smaller value like 0.1. So now you can see the effect very subtle here. And let's make it to 4D and increase a scale a little bit, and also this W value as per your liking. Now this multiply value determines the effect of the noise, but as you can see, it is modifying the whole object. I just want the basic shape to remain at the ground and only the noise to go in the Z direction. So let's tackle that. So for that, I'm going to use a value. So add a value node. Let's make it 0.2 and add this value here. Now I need to subtract this value from this effect, but with a division of 2. So let's add another math node. Set it to divide and divide it by 2. The same value will be divided by 2. And then let's add another math node. Now subtract this multiply value from this divide value. Set it to subtract. So this setup makes it stay on the ground and only the noise will affect it. So now if you change the value, our effect happens on the ground, but the ground itself stays on the XY plane. Okay, so now let's fill our ground plane with some assets. So here I have quickly created some low poly tree assets. These are basic shapes, and I have added a simple shader, and I have also created these pretty simple low poly mountains. So now let's add these to our ground. So for trees and mountains, I have created a separate collection group. So you can see mountains are put in a mountain collection and all the trees are in the tree collection. So now let's go to our geometry node editor. Let's drag our tree collection inside. And because this face has all the ground data, we are going to distribute points. So let's add distribute point on faces. Add this to the mesh. And now instance on point. Add the point to points and our tree collection geometry to instance. Now let's add the instance to join geometry. And right now they are instancing at their original position. So in the collection info, check these two, separate children and reset children, and also pick instance. So now these are instanced onto our ground, but this whole plane is ground, so these are instanced here underwater as well. So let's remove these trees from here. So I'm gonna use a delete geometry node. So let's add a delete geometry node. And in this delete geometry, we'll use the same proximity output. So here is our proximity output. From this multiply, let's plug this value to our selection and change the point to instance, so that now the proximity is deciding the deletion of instances from the center. In the instance on point nodes, you can see the close proximity of objects like this. To avoid this type of effect, you can just go to your distribute point on faces node and go to Poisson disk. So here you have an option of minimum distance. So you can add this. So it decides the minimum distance between two instances so that the objects are not merging into each other. Alright, now let's add these mountains. So I want to add these mountains to the side of our ground. So I'll distribute these on the curve itself. So let's drag the mountain collection to our node editor. Now I'm going to use a node that is curve to point node. It gives me this option of length and also the normal of the curve. So I'll plug my basic curve from this set position node to here. This is our basic set position. And now let's add the instance on point node. Plug the points to point and our geometry collection to instance. Again, separate children and reset children, and here pick instance. Let's join it, and here are the mountains. Let's increase the length. So this length value determines the count. Now let's move these to the side, and very initially we determined the width of our ground. So I'll use this width value to determine the offset of these. Now let's align these mountains to the rotation of our curve. So for that, let's add a Euler node. So align Euler to vector. Plug the rotation from curve to points to rotation and output rotation to our instance rotation. So now these are aligned, but this flips our x and y. So select the z. So now it is upward, but again because x and y are flipped, so the translate value of y, change it to x. So now these are proper. Now let's instance these mountains on this side as well. So I am again going to use this translate instance node. So shift D to duplicate it. And again combine XYZ. Plug the instance to the instance. And I want the negative value this time. So I'll add another math node. And multiply this value with -1. So plug the value here. Plug it to X. Vector to translate. And finally the instance to our join geometry. Now to add a little bit of variation to these mountains, let's add a random value node. So shift A, random value, make it vector and plug it to scale of the instance on point node. Give it a minimum value of about 0.8 and a maximum value of about 1.1. So this varies the scale. Similarly, you can vary the rotation, but rotation is already plugged with our align node. So we can add another rotation here. So add a rotate instance node. Now I want to plug this rotate instance for both of these translates. So I'll add another join geometry node. I'll join these two beforehand and just plug this rotate after this. So now it affects both of these. Now you can change the z value to give it a random rotation. Alright, so finally using the same techniques, I have used some more objects to scatter on our ground and water. So I have distributed some rocks, these flowers, and also some fog planes. So this is how it finally looks. And of course, because it is all procedural, anytime you can just select your curve, go to edit mode, and just draw any shape you want. So finally, to create that simple animation, I just created this closed loop path and I attached this simple paper plane to this curve and used the follow path constraint, and this is the result. Now as always, you can download this Blender project file. I'll put the link in the description and I'll meet you in the next video. Thank you so much. Bye bye.